Hello all, and welcome to another edition of Low Code Campfire for May 26, 2023. This is episode 99. Who knew we could get this far? This is an event we do every Friday this hour, and it's an all skill levels welcome community gathering where we get together, share techniques, challenges, experiences in the use of Plantain app in general. Plantain app in specific, low code in general, and appreciate it if you bring something to show or ask, and hopefully you'll be able to get some help from the community. All these episodes are recorded and put out onto our YouTube channel, so you can get there, youtube.com/plantainapp, and do subscribe so you'll know when we put new episodes out there. This is the agenda we run, but it's really pretty informal. We'll talk about whatever's going on with you. We'll start with first call and then see where it goes. After an hour or so, we'll jump into afterglow. So do engage with us. And if you've got noise going on behind you, please mute, but otherwise be nice. You can submit questions and topics in advance, so that's the spot to do that. And if you show up about 2 minutes late, you can miss all that junk I just said. Hello, Mark. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi, Dale.
Hello, Dale.
Oh, hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, we go right on to first call, and I'm guessing that there's two of you on this call that are going to talk about the same thing. Who's got it?
I'll stand down and let the first one go.
No, you call it out, Jerry. Tell us what it was.
Yeah, mine's probably, I would be amazed if there's another person on here going to be exactly in the same world I was in. But if since you've given me the talking stick, I will take off first. My is going to be a little bit more informative to the other programmers. I kind of figured out my own solution, and maybe it's just because I'm an idiot and I don't know any better. But my issue revolves around execute action on entity lists. So you basically load an entity, guys, and then you want to execute some actions on each record in the entity, kind of like looping through an old school array and performing some things on something, and then moving on to the next record and moving on to the next record, and so on and so on. Dale, there is an option in the execute actions on entity list that lets you remember variables, not remember variables, do something with variables. I have yet to ever understand and even be able to do some type of testing to prove or disprove that any of those functions function differently. I just don't think I understand it. But guys, what I was finding in my world was I needed to design a system that would load an entity from a SQL query. So I gather up a few hundred records, and I owe these people money. And no problem, we're interfaced with a little company called Hyperwallet, and I just call their API and I deposit some money in their account, and I'm on to the next one. And so in theory, all we really do is we just loop through, call a server request. Yeah, there you go, Dale. That's what we're looking at. But when the server request finishes, it returns back a JSON string that then I would parse the JSON into tokens. And there is one particular token when a payment is successful, there's one particular token comes back and says that it's all good. And I use that token to determine on my next action whether I'm going to update some data in a SQL table. That's fine, except when a particular Hyperwallet server request fails. And it doesn't fail because of the connection. It fails because the person I'm trying to pay some money to is not allowed to receive some money for whatever reason that may be. Hyperwallet returns a different JSON response string. It's not the same string with a different column in it that says, successful or failed. It's an entirely different string. And so what I noticed, Dale, was on the record before. So if I process a record and it's successful, I now have a token in scope that has the word success in it, we'll say.
Yep.
And I go to the next record and that one fails. because I got a different JSON string back and I parsed a different JSON string, that original success token is still in scope and still alive. And so when I go to my next action, it says, hey, if certain variable equals success, do this. It's going to do it every time, even on the failed transactions. And it was writing erroneous data. I'm going out of my mind trying to figure out why that's working, because I turned on this option, don't save iteration tokens at all, thinking in theory that that might clear all of my tokens despite where they came from. And as I loop into my next record, I get a nice fresh start and over again. That proved to not be true. My fix was very old school and very simple, but I initialized the tokens that I knew Hyperwallet was going to return. I initialized them with null values, or basically just empty values, at the beginning of each loop, thus clearing the variable. And then the Hyperwallet server request is called, and they'll repopulate it with my parse JSON, and the tokens will repopulate or recreate that token. And on she goes. And that was my quick fix. The lesson of the day would be, let's learn what context behavior really means. And then maybe do a very short lesson on the scope of variables through that looping construct. And my findings, guys, as I can tell you now, programmer to programmer, if you've got variables that are not part of the entity itself, maybe they're calculated, something else, and you need them to be fresh for each record, you need to initialize those variables at the very beginning of your loop each time. And as elementary as that is, and as obvious as that sounds, I missed that, hoping that this was behaving just a little bit differently. But, if we were programming in C# or any other language for that matter, and we were traversing an array of some sort, that's what we would have done. So I just went back to old school and did that, and life is good. So there's my 5-minute overview of what I encountered and how I fixed it. And I hope that it helps any of you that might need to loop through records, do some calculated variables, and make decisions on those variables. It will become very important that to keep those variables in scope for each row would be to certainly clear or set your variables, or declare them, as we used to say in the old days, at the beginning of each loop in your iteration. That's my story, Dale, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, so I wish I could give you a clear answer. And maybe we can discover with a couple of minutes of poking here whether it does anything or not. At the end of the day, I mean, I think you came to probably some of the things that I knew, that I've had trouble with that setting, getting it to do what I expected to do. And initialization, point blank, I'm going to initialize that variable, definitely works. And so that's a good thing. I'm going to try, so I'm going to just do a little experimentation, and actually I should open it up. If anybody already knows this answer and wants to share, we'll do that. But other than that, we'll explore a little bit. So I'm going to select user ID from users. So this will give me a list of users. It's going to put it into user list as a list name. So that's what we're going to iterate through. And so for each entry in user list, I am going to say, don't save the iteration tokens. My action is going to be a context to create a token that is called ID, and I'm going to give it user list, user ID. So with each iteration, ID should have some user ID. And to prove that it does, I am going to log event and say the user ID is ID. Whoop. I don't want to do that. I'm going to say so we're getting it from we're setting it here in this loop. So because we said, so this is going to prove that it's working and doing work. Because we said don't save the iteration tokens, I would expect that ID would at the end not have any value. So let's start there. So if I go to output and say ID and say output ID, and I'm going to actually make one little modification here. I'm going to say top 3, just so we don't have tons of records. I don't know how many are in the system, so we'll get 3 records every time. All right, so if we save and test this, this is going to be Campfire 99 iteration. Test, run it, and ID has no value at the end. So this, so long as it worked, and let's check our logs here. We look at our logs. We got user ID 55, 33, and 50. So we got 3 records, and yet at the tail end, nothing existed. So, so that was good. So now in between, let's see what exists. If we clone this and put it up in the front and call it the, this is going to be the before note. Right, so if it's this is the circumstance you were trying to deal with, right? That you're setting it it is becoming set in the middle, and does it exist? So first time through should be nothing. Then it gets set, then it gets reported. In the loop, the question is, does it continue to exist or not? So this is I'm going to make it be the after note. This makes sense to you so far, Jerry?
Yes, it does. And when you're finished proving that that's behaving properly, then we're going to introduce a new way of thinking.
Well, yeah, and I think I have the next thing here. So we've got the before is blank is ID, then 55, then ID. So it's going back to it doesn't exist, right? Being reset every time it's going to blank. But I think the problem that you run into is if this thing, or one of the nuances is that if this ID exists before you get into the for each, that changes the behavior completely. So if we go to create a token, and we'll add ID, and it's going to say default value. So now when we save and test this guy, notice now we're getting an output. The fact that it exists before provides it a place to exist after. And so that behavior, the context behavior, doesn't do what you expect anymore. And so now if we look at the logs, we can see it started as default value, and now after 55, before 55, the presence of it before, outside of this for each, gives it a context to continue to exist forever. So it changes the scope. Does that jive with your experience, or is there another nuance?
It does. The fact that you use a token called ID, and I missed that part when you created the token. What was the value for that token?
So I created it as ID and gave it a value.
Okay, you just put
value. So okay. I was just being arbitrary.
Yeah, got it. But then token ID got replaced with the user ID as the iteration started. Is that Correct. What we saw? Okay.
Yes. So it started as default, then
Got it. Okay, I'm with you now. So imagine this. Imagine that token was not called ID, and it was called anything but ID, and you set that value to it. It's going to hold that value through every iteration because nothing's changing. So if you go in and that particular token that you call it ID when you did your create and update tokens, if that was some other external token and it gets loaded with value.
ID was arbitrary. We could call it anything. You want to call it success?
Well, no, it's also ID is that token is named ID, but you also named your in your execute actions, you're loading ID with the user ID. So ID is getting replaced every iteration. It's getting replaced. You just set it to default value on the load, if you want to call it that. But then as it spend through the list, ID kept getting replaced with new user IDs.
Right.
If that token has nothing to do with user ID and it's just a unique, it's just a token. It might have been a calculation. It might have come from a server request. It would have stayed default value for the entire loop. Go into your create tokens and change that name to be something else and watch what happens.
Change this name?
No, leave that one alone. That one's fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's that guy right there. It's no longer an ID token. It's something else. Just call it test, if you will. Yeah, Jerry's perfect. Okay. And when you run that, it's going to loop through all your records, but Jerry's going to be default value every single time.
Well, so
oh, wait a minute. That's not inside the entity list, is it?
It's not. And
yeah, that's why. Okay, so that's basically we just renamed that token.
I'm not sure that ran actually. See,
yeah, to make this very realistic, what we want to do is you can get rid of that first action on your workflow and you can add that action inside the entity looper. That's where we're getting, I won't say getting into trouble. I just want to make sure as a programmer that we all understand the scope of those variables and how it thinks.
And that's what I was trying to illustrate. When ID doesn't exist outside the for each, right? It never right now this that's like it doesn't exist. It's called Jerry. So ID doesn't exist. It doesn't exist here, doesn't exist here, it becomes into existence only on this loop.
Yes.
And because it comes into existence, into existence only on this loop, when we look at these, every time it goes back to ID as the before value. It's becoming reset.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
now let's change this. Update all tokens in the original context. That's the only change we'll make.
Okay.
Save and test. So now ID is popping up. It continues to exist outside, and it starts out not existing, but then is retained throughout. So we get a different behavior.
I see that. Okay.
So, so it's nuanced, right? If it only exists within that loop, and you use this I'm sorry, the don't save, then it does what you think it's going to do. But if it existed outside before you get in here, then it has a place, it already exists, and so therefore it gets updated. It's a little bit of a weird behavior and a little bit of an implied behavior. So I would say your final answer is really a great answer. If you initialize things that you guarantee that you're not depending on any implicit behavior.
Yeah, I still want to illustrate to you though, if we go inside the loop, and so just in theory, bear with me just for a second, Dale, if we're inside the loop and one of the actions inside the loop is altering a variable, and that's where you can get in trouble if whatever action you're using to alter that variable doesn't alter it in the middle of the loop, that token gets retained, from what I could tell, irregardless of what the settings were. And that's where I was getting into trouble. So you'd have to kind of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So let's try an example of that. How would do you want to modify ID, or do you want to create something different? What would you like?
Well, in I'm not sure how to do it exactly on your example, but I just proved if you will go into that particular action that you're looking at now is kind of irrelevant now to me. It can just go away completely. You could remove it from the workflow. And then let's go inside the wait a minute. I'm sorry. Don't delete that, please. I thought you was on a different one. Okay. And open that back up. And let me just take a look real quick. Yes, this is where you're assigning the user ID. That's fine. Okay. So if you were to add another create update tokens and create that Jerry token again, and you can put it, I'd put it above, it's fine, and create that one just call it Jerry and just stick in some arbitrary value. Perfect. Okay. And now make sure that that gets logged.
Oops. Yeah. So we're logging it before and after, and we're going to go with don't save.
And
good.
And when you run it, I think it's going to prove that it's just going to say hello world every loop. Okay, so now as we're seeing that happen, so okay,
this thing here is impacting it.
Yeah,
let's get rid of that.
Exactly. That was the one I was saying a minute ago. You could just delete that one out. We don't need that anymore.
So now this is let's see if we can find the start here. 44. So Jerry hello world, Jerry hello world. In other words, it goes back and forth. The value gets reverted. It doesn't.
No, that must why would it do that? Why would it say Jerry is Jerry?
Let's clean this up a little bit.
Okay.
In my logging, I'm going to change it to be ID equals, so it has a default of blank. And
Jerry, does he need to move the second one up the stack one?
Maybe. But as long as we're inside that loop.
Before logging and some creation, and then after logging.
Righto. So, but yeah, I think we're okay there. So let's let that log update again. Yeah, I think you're before logging. Why is it saying Jerry there? Why is it not saying hello world? Because that's the value we wanted to set, was just hello world, and then just let it go. So
well, it's reverting. I'm a little bit confused why it's saying Jerry, because
yeah, the value was never set to Jerry that I ever saw. I in that particular one. I think we should go reinvestigate that. That create token.
I think the logging is change the logging in both places. See if I can make any sense of this.
All right.
All right, so now we're getting Jerry as default, and then it goes to hello world after, goes back to default, back to hello world. It changes every time because of the behavior, because of this don't save iteration tokens. If we change this, say in the original context, we'll get a different behavior. So here's the next run.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Dale. All right. I have the answers to this. Whatever execute on entity list that is out there on version 5.15 or near has a bug in it, because yours is working exactly as expected. That has been corrected along the journey somewhere.
It's possible. We could test that, but I don't know. But let me just make sure that if we go back to the don't save.
Yeah.
So every time it hits default, as it goes into the beginning. So every begin is default.
Yep.
Right? And then again, there's this nuance that if the token gets created outside of that execute actions, you get a different behavior.
Got it.
And once it gets created, now it lives forever.
And I would expect that, because nothing altered it.
See, now the first loop it shows that this was created, and now it retains hello world because the existence of it makes it continue to exist. It ignores the for each the context setting of don't save.
Okay, that's good to know, Dale. And again, I'll re-describe my exact issue, and let's see if how I could have handled it better, assuming everything was working properly. Inside the execute action loop, I'm calling an API and I'm getting back a JSON string that I parse into tokens. Mm-hmm. So those tokens, when I parse into tokens, we're creating those tokens every loop. It creates.
It should create the menu.
It creates a menu. That's right. But if that JSON string coming back from the server request is different, and any one of those iterations, guess what? The tokens that I parsed the record before still are in scope, and they're still alive and fine. And the new parsing the tokens, that's a whole new set of tokens. Because
So is there any chance that the tokens that get created in your loop were created earlier in any other part of your workflow?
no. The only time they're created is when the server request returns and we parse it, which is on every lap, by the way. And on every iteration, the response string, the JSON string coming back, could be formatted completely different than the one before.
And
that's not on us. That's on Hyperwallet. They're not really good at that, apparently.
yeah,
And,
it would be nice to receive a consistent response. And I understand that
Yeah.
you get a different response with different content. You've got, and then it interacts poorly with the way this was set up. Again, there's it's certainly possible what you said that.
so my fix
done
was
something different.
inside the loop, the variables, the tokens that are important to me, which is only 2 of them, at the beginning of each loop, this is inside the actions, executions of the list. I set the values to empty, and then that corrected everything. So now every lap through this thing, I get a fresh set of empty tokens, and either they get populated or they don't.
Yep. And so you're safe.
And I'm safe. And I don't think that what you just highlighted is even relevant at that point for me, because everything else will get reloaded in the SQL query. Every lap, I'll get a new record. That's not even in question. That doesn't have any conditions on it of any kind. And then now I call this API, I get back the response, I parse the tokens. The one particular token that I'm looking for that tells me, yes, this is a good record, Jerry, you can process it. Then in my next stack, which just happens to be a SQL action, I have in the condition, if Hyperwallet : status equals good, then perform all this. And if every one of them was good, it would perform just perfect. But any one of them's bad, that good is still there, and it was processing it anyway. And it just took me a while to dig through that. I don't want to burn up a whole Friday on that, but now that I've seen what you're seeing, I have enough to go bite into and see if maybe I could have set that outside the loop. I mean, could have I initialized my variables outside of the loop, and then this thing would have automatically cleared those variables on every iteration had I had the proper selection, the one that you have highlighted.
Initializing them outside the loop would actually cause the problem.
Okay.
Because, and I'm just going to point out the nuance of what I've highlighted here, because it's not entirely clear. It's saying generated in this action. So tokens that existed before this action are not generated in this action. Therefore, it has different rules. But if the tokens are unique to this execute action, they're generated in this action. They came into existence in this action. That's where they get reset. And then, we haven't even tackled the other 2 values very much. So there is nuance to this. Your safest thing is what you've ended up doing. Because we spent time on this, I want to point out there's a setting in here that is a little bit, this is not related to your question, but it will be important to somebody who's following along at a later time. When you run a SQL query, there's this setting clear before loading. You would think that user list would always get populated based on the query you're done, but there was an existing behavior where they wanted to be able to allow kind of this additive. I'm going to run a SQL query, and then I'm going to add more records by another SQL query. And so the original default behavior was that we kept adding to the list, and that can confuse people. So the safest thing to do is actually this, right? You want to start out with an empty list, and you're going to put things into it, and then you're going to process that list. It's kind of the default is a little bit backwards here to me. It's just because of the history of the product that we supported this originally. That So I just want to point out that exists, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So that's very cool. Is that implying that if you did a SQL query into an entity and then you did another SQL query into the same entity, it would append the new records into that entity?
That's what it's implying. So let's find out. So it will export that and import it back. So we have the same thing again. And so it's doing the same thing into user list, but this time I'm going to say order by user ID. And so it's going to get a different 3 on this one. So I should have 6 now when I run. So let's see if that's true. So see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 afters. So it is additive, right? And if we versus if we do this and we check the box, that first one isn't going to make a difference. And so we'll only be dealing with 3. So 1, 2, 3. So you can get an additive behavior if it's something that you just need to know. So that's all a very cool one. So if I can, I mean, I'd like to call on people today. I know Anthony's been following along, and he had the one that I thought that you were going to be telling me about, Jerry, because it was a Firebase thing. And in the spirit of sharing information, I hope Anthony can share what he's got.
Yeah, I've been using the Firebase on my apps, and a couple of days ago, suddenly got all these errors on my logs. I had my developer say, "Oh, I've updated your app, but I can't access any notifications." So going into the logs, it was saying that the Firebase send API that was currently listed is no longer available. So they've updated their system with their authentication. So I've had to go in and set up a new project, and then that gets passed across to the a new API, which means I don't use the Firebase actions from PlanTenApp. I had to do my own custom server action because I had to put a sound variable into it, which wasn't being passed. But that means the Firebase actions may need to be upgraded. And if people want to use a push notification through that, they'll have to set up a project, which will then have to be passed through as a variable to the API call that the PlanTenApp Firebase actions will eventually have to make.
Well, you certainly have mine and Dennis's attention.
I only just literally sorted this out today, but then there's still some issue with the authentication saying it's not working, but I can get the notification through on my phone.
Well, I do know, I mean, in the original way, and I'm going to try and formulate this as a question. Did this just stop working because Firebase made a change and you had to rethink your software to make it work? And if so, when did Firebase make this change?
I think it's only happened in the last day or two that I've noticed it. I literally had the email come back from the person who was making the that Revolution app saying, "Oh, look, I was having trouble accessing." So I went to use it, and when I was finding all this, I've got these other errors that I was getting with Search Boost. This one popped up in the log saying it couldn't go through to the site. It was getting a 404 error for the API call. So I had to go to the Google site, the Firebase, and see that there's now a change in the way that the authentication is done.
Oh, God.
It's not that difficult. I've just changed the API call, put a, let me see if I can find it. I'll just bring it up. And then they've also changed the JSON format. So you don't need to have a separate format for Android, don't need to have a separate format for iPhone. They now combine it so you can have the same, you don't have to do two different calls to the two different apps. You can just have the one call and it'll address each of the different versions.
Okay.
Um,
And I
so
wonder if that was if the legacy return JSONs are still functioning for a while, or if they just did what we call a breaking change in Plan App and didn't notify us of that. But we have not been notified of our push notifications not working yet.
Dale, if you want to let me share, I can show the change in the code.
Please do.
So this is the new, so I've had to make my own little workflow. The previous one is this address, just this Google API FCM send. And then because I had to sort of modify it to put a little sound file action in to get the app to work. And then you had your bearer token, it was a key value below. This time it's changed to this address. So you have to then have a project created with the Google. You'll go into, if you go into your Google console, you look to see where you would have had your Firebase API set up, or if it's not set up. This is then created, you then got a project name, so this has to be added in. The JSON is only slightly changed, but instead of saying API key, it's changed to a bearer token. And that's now just that little change there. I can get the action to work, but I had to turn off the errors because there was something still saying about authentication, but the action was still firing. So I've just got to look into that a little bit more as to whether I'm passing the right value, but it seems to be working correctly. It just says there's an error with it, but I get my notifications and it works that I can click on my notification, open up my app like it was doing before. So it's that little thing to be changed over.
So you didn't get any notification in advance?
No, the only thing, it was literally the developer saying, oh, I was having trouble trying to test out the new Android version to get the notification to click on the screen. He couldn't send himself a notification. And it's only when I went in, I was looking at other things and saw that the log wasn't, there's an error in the log, and then go back to the automation and then see that there was a error with the firing of the automation that I had.
Jerry, I did a little research on our side, and I see people getting notifications. As of 9:05 a.m. this morning, this one person I'm looking at got a notification of a status change on an ITA.
Okay. Anthony, how long have you been, when did you originally turn on your Firebase stuff? Has it been running for a really long time?
12 months.
Okay, that seems reasonable. The reason I'm asking is I'm just going on memory, and I'm gonna try and prove this before we even hang up. Your new way of doing it kind of looks like the way I've always been doing it. And I just wonder if they made this change a long time ago, and then they finally
Possibly.
Finally said, okay, enough of that. I forgot what the right adjective is to describe that, but now it's gone. And you fell in that, where I may not be falling in that because I may already be advanced to that point. I don't know.
I don't know what the Firebase actions are working, because I've had to go outside of the Firebase actions that Plant and App have. So if you're using the Firebase ones, I don't know if they've using the old API, but because there was no setting in the Firebase actions that PlanetApp have to actually set your project.
Ah, okay.
So if you're setting the code yourself, then you would have set it that way. If you were using the actions, it may not be. It may be using the old API setting. So, but instead I've had to do it this way to get a little sound working when the notification pops up.
Anthony, what version of PlanetApp are you running?
This is 123.
So, okay, well, I'm going to go do a little research on that, Dennis, and try and figure out where we are. The fact that we're still running today and he is not, well, that's a little alarming, actually.
Well, as I said, I'm back up and running by making that little change.
But you had to, and had you not,
yeah,
you'd be down in that. So, okay.
I wouldn't have known about it because I do not just a push notification. I've got an email notification that goes with the push notification just in case people don't get their push. So people would have still got an email notification that I'd send them either a message or an appointment or some other update.
Got it. Got it. Well, I know for a fact I am using the PlanetApp Firebase actions to communicate with Firebase and send those pushes. And I did that because I could never get server requests to work for me because I had such a hard time getting the bearer token. And I don't know if you did some fancy programming to get your bearer token, but I know since then that we being PlanetApp has written an action to get the bearer token. So
the bearer token, are you talking about the ID of the phone or the?
No, I'm talking
token?
about the bearer token was required to authenticate the actual use of
if you go to your Firebase console, you can export the JSON, and it's actually within the JSON file that you provide that goes in your credential parts for the FCM action.
Yeah, we did all
so
that.
it's sitting in there. And then you just got to apply it as a the authentication bearer there under authentication.
Okay. All right. Well, I may be leaning on you for that.
Oh, you got a programmer leaning on a doctor. That's good.
I just knew you've mentioned before, Jerry, that you have lots of transactions, lots of notifications going on, and I if there's a change afoot, I didn't want you to be caught by surprise.
I really
from Anthony. I wanted to make sure you were in.
It's been a while since I've had to address my Firebase push where I'm actually communicating them, but yeah, to your point, Anthony, PlanetApp has an action, and there's a credential key that we point to that I think we put something in the web file, the web config file.
Yeah, you've got to place that gets placed onto a directory on your computer.
Yes.
You create a reference within your web config, and the PlanetApp action is then looking for that particular file, and obviously it's then extracting the token it needs for the action to work because it's part of one of the parts of the JSON file.
Got it. And then yeah, but we're still running as of right at this moment in time. I'm not exactly sure.
I checked a few other people, Jerry, and we are still receiving and passing on notifications to our users.
Okay. Anthony, were you doing your little sound bite that you were talking about, or any other customization? Were you able to make that work using the Firebase, the PlanetApp Firebase action?
No, to get because the way that the developer was receiving and processing the JSON file, the sound part was sitting outside of an element that he was looking at. So I've had to then make that JSON to place that sound part inside the message area, which he was then looking at, for him to then pick it up. So instead of then going, oh, you need to change your app, I just changed the JSON code from my end.
Okay.
So that's why I went for the more of a server request Firebase. And then I just did all the testing through Postman. So that gave me the right JSON format. And then I just carried that over into the server request.
Good to know. That's the way I originally tried to write it, using just server requests, and I failed miserably. And Dale was gracious enough to find out that we just happen to have a Firebase action.
Yep.
And it was like,
well, they gave that to me first, but then I was wanting to put a sound notification when it popped up.
Yep.
And the way he sort of created the code, it was sitting in a certain way on the JSON. The Firebase action didn't pass that correctly.
Okay.
But if you did it on Postman and you formatted it in that way, then it worked for the app. So that's why I had to go and modify it.
So I think what I would ask of you, Anthony, is would you be kind enough to let Dale know exactly what would be done to the action to make it compliant with the new way of thinking? And so we can work with our internal engineers and make this Firebase action work. So they wouldn't have to guess at it, you know, they could just know that this has changed or the credentials have changed. But I'm real curious if the reason why I'm still running successfully is because I wasn't doing anything fancy at all. I'm not trying to pass that soundbite in that you are. I'm just, you know, I'm strictly by the book. It's about as simple as you can possibly get. You know, I wonder if it was some of your stuff that threw them. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what the Firebase action, what sort of API that's calling. But this is the one that I was making use of.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for that information. That's powerful. And my shoulder's been hurting me a lot. Is there anything you could do for me on this to help?
Yeah, I'm a foot surgeon, so I'll rub
Okay, never mind. All right. I'll catch you later then. I just wanted to, you know, there's one thing that Dale will attest to. We are a group of many talents, aren't we, Dale?
We absolutely are. And
we are a group of many talents. Thank you for your
all right. Thank you guys for sharing back and forth. So, you know, I think I'm going to flip back to first call because I jumped in directly to some things. So anybody else bring something that they wanted to talk about today? I've left you 7 minutes.
I made a custom table with pagination.
Custom. Oh.
Yeah, so I was just about to show you before you switched
Oh,
off.
I'm sorry. I assumed incorrectly. Let me share and
thought it'd be of
show and tell. This is.
Whoops. Yep, there it is. So on the my little chat app, the issue with the tables is with trying to render some of the displays, it'll always be slow. So I did what Game's been doing is went to ChatGPT and asked it how to actually make a component for us. So I can load up it's only one really weird thing is I've got a thing to display an icon, but it doesn't display correctly the first time around. But this is now just straight JavaScript doing a simple call back to pull out some JSON, and then I've made the little pagination between the two of them. Does the click hover to bring out the messages.
So you're avoiding this is not an action grid, correct?
No, I've taken the functionality where I've got the SQL call already been made, moved that into the API and workflow in the back end, instead of passing out whole chunks of the whole formatted HTML, just passing out just a bit of the JSON for what I need, and then using, where are we? this sort of setup here to then render out the updated page each time.
Mhm. I'm not sure, you mentioned dropdown. I'm pretty sure part of what he's been doing is we actually generated a new
Yeah,
chat format that rides that is a template for our listings module. So we're still keeping all the listings functionality, but
Yep.
wheeling it in a different way.
I was just trying to increase the speed of my page.
I absolutely get it. And I mean, there's so many ways to skin a cat, right? But so it's interesting to see, yeah, using that to get outside. And if you didn't recognize it, earlier I responded with, the cleaning up of event logs.
Yes, I haven't got onto that. I've got an event log. It's not the event log. It's the exceptions log, which is 13 gigabytes in size.
And I don't know if you recognized it, but that was lots of Chat GPT, 75% Chat GPT and 25% Dale. And so getting some good SQL was, I mean, it's useful to have a tool like that available. Cool. Parting comments, anybody? I had a JavaScript thing. Somebody wanted to be able to initialize a drop-down list, and I think this was let's see, this was on the community forum. So if you select a value here and you pick a value here, and then you pick a different value here, they wanted to clear this drop-down with autocomplete. And there was a lot of JavaScript going back and forth. Hey, you could do it this way. Hey, you could do it that way. But this is actually one of those that's easier to do than you would think. I did a bind expression that just says set the drop down with autocomplete to blank, and avoided JavaScript. Just let Lantern app do what it needed to do to clear it out. So just interesting that sometimes the easier answer, the low code answer, is easier. Anyway.
Some of the issues I've had with that, if you put in the tokens and I'm doing certain other things on a page, it doesn't work unless I do Angular code, and it does work. If I use Angular to get the actual value rather than using the token.
And this is just, one particular case where it works. I know there are other that depending on what you're trying to do, it's more involved than that. But anyway, okay, we have made it to our hour. I'm going to find my little end slide here and say happy low coding. For those of you who happen to be in the States and celebrate Memorial Day, I wish you happy Memorial Day. And anyone who wants to hang around for an off-the-record conversation for a few minutes, you're welcome to do that. But if nothing else, we'll see you again next Friday.